Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Stephanie Rost. I'm a PhD candidate at Gothenburg University in Sweden. I'm in the Department of Social Work. However, my main area of research is around food security in response to climate change and possible solutions and adaptations that we might be able to undertake. I also have a research interest in post-collapse scenarios, where I examine the possibility of societal collapse or civilization collapse and the implications of that on our communities, our food systems, and so on. So today I'll be talking to you about a research paper that is still underway, which examines the worst case scenarios for Sweden in terms of food security and climate change. So, perhaps it goes without saying at this conference, which is focused on climate change, the impacts of these and the impacts that we will face pose a severe and escalating threat to global food security. Each degree of warming intensifies these risks, yet many national adaptation plans, including Sweden's, seem to fall short of preparing for worst case scenarios. They're generally focused on scenario 2.5, which is from the IPCC assessment, which is in the lower end of continued carbon dioxide emissions. Whereas just now we seem to be on the higher end of the scenarios, looking at more like the 8.5 scenario, which means there is an underrepresentation in the literature of what will happen or what might happen. And what do we even do about that? So this presentation examines the severe yet plausible outcomes for food security in Sweden, particularly due to climate change. And it's used as a case study, not just because I'm here, but for a number of different reasons that will become clear during the discussion. But it emphasises how global disruptions and tipping points may affect individuals and communities, especially the most vulnerable, who, as we know, are much more at risk from all the climate impacts that we're going to face. Okay. So current research shows that climate change, as I've already said, will significantly impact on global food security, with each degree of warming intensifying these effects. And this is what's been researched and acknowledged by climate science in terms of in the IPCC report and other authors. However, in Sweden, the National Adaptation Plan primarily addresses gradual climate changes and lacks a comprehensive assessment of severe risks posed by climate tipping points or global food system disruptions. Specifically, the National Adaptation Plan does not consider the potential for cascading extreme events, such as the collapse of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation Current, the AMOC, or the Amazon rainforest shifting from a carbon sink to a carbon emitter, which could drastically reduce global food supplies. And the citations for this would be Professor Ramsdorff of the Potsdam Institute and the Global Tipping Points report. The National Adaptation Plan in Sweden overlooks specifically as well the human impact of food insecurity, and that's particularly how this would actually affect individuals and communities, especially those who are most vulnerable. And from previous research that I have undertaken, food poverty, which is a slightly different definition from food insecurity, but food poverty appeared to be on the increase in Sweden, to the point where it actually bypassed levels in the United Kingdom, for example. But in Sweden, it's a much more invisible phenomenon and has lots of layers of stigma and shame attached to it, which makes it much more difficult to measure because people are wary of actually saying that they're struggling. So the omission in the National Adaptation Plan really limits our understanding of how Sweden's population can adapt to such crisis, and it leaves social work, which is the department that I'm in, without sufficient guidance to support those at highest risk during those cascading climate events. And while the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency document, which you can see in the next slide, it's called Om krisen eller kriget kommer, which means if crisis or war comes, emphasizes that individual preparedness is important. And this is a document that's sent out to all Swedish citizens. A new one was just sent out more recently, including the risk in the document of nuclear fallout. However, even in this, climate impacts are addressed only briefly, as it really is more focused on a kind of wartime resilience. The obviously recent stress along the kind of due to Russia and the war with Ukraine and Sweden's joining of NATO has led to an increased awareness of the possibility of Sweden becoming involved in a war or conflict. And this is the focus of this individual preparedness that the government appears to be trying to instill in people. And yet it's not actually focusing on climate impacts and the really serious and imminent risks of these. And in it, it assumes that individuals will have the resources to store food in advance, which during global food shocks or during the impacts of climate, this might not actually be possible because there might be breakdowns in supply chains, there might be harvest loss, large-scale famines. All of these things mean that placing the responsibility on the individual to just store enough ignores that possibility that the food won't be there to begin with. So this gap in actually researching worst case scenario has been highlighted by researchers such as Davidson and Kemp in 2024, who argue that a focus on the worst case scenarios is essential for preparedness, especially in terms of mitigating human suffering from potential food shortages. So it's absolutely critical for us to explore those in terms of climate change and how that will affect food security in Sweden, understand how that will impact on individuals, also assess our current level of preparedness. Where are we in that? How prepared are we just now? And also understand the role of social work in helping support people during those times. The reason to focus on Sweden in particularly, again, not just because of I'm in Sweden just now, but Europe as a whole is warming at the fastest rate of any continent in the world, according to the European Environment Agency. And Sweden has had a higher temperature increase than many other countries on Earth. And this may not seem as obvious or visible than countries which already have a higher temperature to begin with. And so if they're going from 38 to 42 degrees Celsius, that seems incredibly dramatic and causes drought. Whereas in Sweden, if the temperature is lower to begin with, having even a higher degree of change won't seem quite as dramatic because it won't have that same consequence. It does, however, have huge other consequences in terms of our ability to grow food. So, in terms of preparedness in Europe, there seems to be a general lack of preparedness in Europe to all the potential outcomes that might happen from food shortages and lack of food, and adapting to situations of increased temperature, less precipitation, more extreme events like the flooding events we've seen in Spain, in Greece, all over the world we've seen it. A survey of Sweden's population reported that 60% of respondents do feel great concern that there won't be enough food in a crisis, and 2/3 of the population wanted to know what they as individuals can do to improve food security. And this was a survey by Lantmännen done this year. So that shows there is a desire, there's a drive for people to have the information and for us to do the research then to be able to find out what that individual can do, what resources can be provided, how they can manage in a situation of crisis. So in previous times in Sweden during the Cold War, Sweden's response to the potential lack of food insecurity was kind of grounded in the premise of the possibility of being blockaded or attacked by a foreign country. So Sweden therefore kind of made plans to mitigate against that threat through a civil defence strategy, where the aims were for increased self-sufficiency in agriculture, which we hear a lot about from different countries now, that's their aim, and shortages of food and agricultural fertiliser in cases of crisis. So it was about gathering stuff together, hoarding it, keeping it in case of an emergency. However, since the Cold War ended, the system was actually dismantled completely, and Sweden became increasingly dependent on international food markets. Now, at the current time, Sweden is independent, or self-sufficient rather, in only three food products: cereals, sugar and carrots. Sweden no longer has any storage of food or materials for times of disaster or crisis. This is the crisis planning preparedness plan sent to all citizens, and the key points of this are highlighted in the slide here. Okay. So, in terms of our research plan for the study, after looking at all the different aspects of and documents around food security in Sweden, our research questions were focused on worst case scenarios. What are the worst case scenarios for individual food security in Sweden due to climate change? How might these scenarios disproportionately affect vulnerable populations? What role can social work play in supporting adaptation and resilience? So first of all, we need to define what the worst case scenarios actually are. So worst case scenarios I define similarly to those described by researchers such as Luke Kemp, 2022, in his work, as severe yet plausible outcomes within the context of climate impacts. So we're not talking about apocalyptic scenarios. The scenarios are bad enough, but we're not talking about if an asteroid strikes the Earth, this is what will happen. It's about plausible ones within the context of climate impacts. These scenarios don't include human extinction. They focus on the extreme events that are possible under the climate models that we have and projections. And these scenarios envision the most severe consequences of climate change that, while not necessarily avoidable, are often overlooked or excluded in the mainstream climate projections and adaptation frameworks. So that the top end, the ones that are just ignored because we hope they won't happen, but they might. So they represent significant risks that are well within the bounds of current scientific understanding and are important for us to actually look at for robust planning and preparedness. So the IPCC models various scenarios of the outcomes of climate change according to different policy decisions and level of carbon emissions. The worst case scenario for them is RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5, which represents a business as usual model where little is done to lower carbon emissions. Under this scenario, the impacts include reduced agricultural output, widespread crop failures, loss of arable land, more frequent and severe droughts and floods, disruptions in food supply chains and global food crisis. The IPCC warns that temperature increases will have impacts not just environmentally but also sociologically, increasing the likelihood of conflict, including those caused by lack of food security. While these projections might seem really bleak, the IPCC projections have come under a lot of criticism for underestimating the potential for warming actually accelerating, and are in fact overly conservative in their estimation of both the temperature increases and of their impacts. The Global Tipping Points report focuses on the tipping points that can be crossed by due to temperature increases. These include Amazon dieback, ice sheet collapse, permafrost thawing, and collapse of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, and that these could have severe effects on food security. They highlight that food systems are vulnerable to these tipping points and particularly affected by levels of rainfall and temperature, both things that we're seeing very visibly now. In their report, they use the case study of a potential AMOP collapse and go through the likely consequences, including on food security. And the authors argue that assessments should go beyond the economic damages. Let's not focus on the money here, to broader human, social, and cultural impacts of crossing Earth's system tipping points, starting with food and water security. This is affecting our very ability to survive. If we don't have food and water, we're not going to last very long. Wallace Wells and the Uninhabitable Earth highlights the risk of severe grain shortages, noting that a 5-degree rise in temperature could produce global grain yields reducing by 50%. In Sweden, another study in 2022 had identified that grain, as I say, is one of the most vulnerable of food products to climate change in Sweden. With regard to social work, because again, that's the department I'm in, authors look at disaster responses by social work, and it's how it's essential to build social capital and resilience amongst communities. Discussions tend not to focus on climate change a lot, but focus more on disaster scenarios. Worst case scenarios are kind of avoided generally, and there's always an assumption of, even if something does happen, if there is a disaster, there will be a resumption of normality following that. So consideration isn't given to the fact that these might be so damaging and continuous and extreme that it decimates our ability to produce food. So, in terms of moving forward, what we're proposing to do is to use scenario analysis to pose the hypothetical scenario of an AMOP collapse as our example to a series of stakeholders to gain their perspectives on what the likely impacts would be for Sweden. We are going to use a funnel approach to use the answers from the climate scientists to then inform questions which we will use to ask agricultural scientists what their view is of these impacts. For example, if a consequence of the AMOP collapse is a reduction in temperature, which we know generally, there's likely to be a cooling in Europe. If the cooling is by 20 degrees, we would then want to ask the agricultural scientists what would the impact be on Sweden's growing ability and capacity of food and the import ability. And then thirdly, we're moving on to another stage of interviewing social workers and civil service organisations who deal with food poverty and food security about what practical things that this would result in. So whatever the agricultural scientists respond in terms of this would lead to a reduction in production or an increase in food prices, we then go to the next layer and say, what would the reality of this be for people? If there is no food product of this on the shelf, if their prices go to this extent, what will be the practical consequences? So that's what we're trying to kind of get down to at that level. Okay, so the responses we're going to be recorded over Zoom interviews or in person with voice recording. They'll then be analysed using the scenario analysis in order to establish what the possible outcomes could be on food security. And the reason that we have chosen in this case to focus on the AMOP collapse is a number of concerning things that have obviously been happening and been reported around the state of the AMOP just now. It has appeared to be slowing in recent decades, and now the prospect of it actually collapsing is no longer, according to Professor Ramsdorff of the Potsdam Institute in his report this year, it's no longer considered to be low risk. Climate scientists, you'll no doubt be aware, recently submitted an open letter to the Nordic Council of Ministers, stating their collective view that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, assessment of the likelihood of the tipping point of the AMOC occurring in the near future have been greatly underestimated. Various models indicate that not only would the collapse of the AMOC lead to significant cooling in Northern Europe, including Sweden, but that is likely to heavily impact on the ability to grow food. And in focusing on that, we tend to focus on that cold area over Europe, but it also should be noted that it will also lead to a warming elsewhere. So given that Sweden is a country heavily reliant on importing its foods, we also rely on the stability of other countries in their ability to grow food. So if both are destabilised, it leaves Sweden in a very vulnerable position, as well as everyone else, but our focus is on Sweden. So as I say, the Potsdam Institute advised that there is a very real risk of crossing this tipping point, and the defining nature of which means it can't go back to the way it was before immediately. This isn't something we can just go, oh no, the AMOC has collapsed, or we'll do this and then it'll be fixed. This is a process that takes about 1,000 years to revert or fix itself in the case of collapse, and we know that from paleoclimate records. But there's also the real risk that given the climate forcing that we've been pushing with the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we have no way to predict whether it would actually go back on at all. And it's absolutely beyond our lifetimes. So we're facing the prospect of condemning many future generations to this climate environment that we've created. Pontes and Menviel in their paper this year also argued that the current scenarios, it looks like there would be a 33% slowdown in the AMOC circulation in the next decade. In the next 10 years, there would be a third slowing. It doesn't take a full collapse to affect climate systems. This would immediately have climate implications globally. So, our findings so far. Grain, as we know, is Sweden's most vulnerable food product, and it is highly susceptible to climate disruptions. A 5-degree temperature increase could reduce global grains by 50%. Northern Sweden faces heightened food insecurity due to existing economic disparities and greater reliance on imports. Limited preparedness within Sweden and wider Europe could overwhelm services during severe crisis, and building social capital and resilience within communities is essential. But in terms of moving forward with this research paper, we're currently awaiting ethical approval before progressing further. But what we know from a mass of literature that is coming out just now is that we would be looking at significant regional cooling in Northern Europe, severe disruption of agricultural production and food imports, and increased difficulty in maintaining food security in the longer term. Okay, so in terms of conclusions, Sweden's heavy reliance on imports and lack of food storage systems create vulnerabilities to climate-driven disruptions. The regional inequalities and insufficient social preparedness and social preparedness exacerbate the risks for the most vulnerable. It leads to a call to action for national and local strategies. They absolutely must include worst-case scenario planning, because this is what has been described as the mother of all tipping points. If we're looking at the AMOC collapse, it will affect global systems in terms of our food security. Social work, again from my department, must integrate climate adaptation into its core functions so that we can continue to try and safeguard vulnerable populations. So obviously we look to the future in terms of our final thought. By focusing on the severe yet plausible scenarios, Sweden can hopefully better prepare for cascading impacts of climate change and ensure a more resilient and equitable future. Once the research has been completed, we will look forward to submitting that so that people can research it themselves and give feedback on what your thoughts are. Many thanks today. Thank you for listening.